welcome to the Small Space Gardening online Facebook Live class. As you have questions, please put them in the comments. And there seems to be somewhat of a delay, but hopefully I'll remember to get to them in time. So I just wanted to start out. I don't think we now, in the midst of this crazy pandemic, don't have to make an argument for why we should grow more food. And why would we want to garden in small spaces? Well, 80% of the US population lives in an urban area. And because it's urban, you know, any opportunities to beautify spaces with plants, plants, as probably all of you know, lower stress levels, and they also provide, you know, they cut down on urban heat, they provide oxygen, so all sorts of good arguments for that. And then it also makes growing more accessible so that you don't have to have a lot of space in order to grow some food. I think that's one big hang-up that people have oftentimes in terms of, oh, I'd love to garden, but I don't have a backyard or I don't have a space. But don't let that stop you. And of course, right now, this is becoming even more important, becoming just a little bit more self-reliant. So I'm always encouraging people that even if they only have a small space, to grow something in a container, in a small pot, something that connects you to the natural world and to the idea of providing a little bit of food for yourself. So just to get into some basics, I think most of you probably already know, it seems like most people in this forum have some level of gardening experience, but obviously you want a south-facing location. That's going to be ideal. It's not that you can't work with east-facing or west-facing. North-facing is pretty tricky, but ideally you have a south-facing location, so even in these small spaces, you're considering that your greens, like mustard greens and lettuces and kales and things like that, need at least 4 hours of sunlight. Your root crops need at least 6 hours, and your fruiting veggies, you know, tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, need at least 8 hours. So, you know, again, the same principles apply, you know, wherever you're growing in terms of the amount of sun. The more sun you have, probably the better your plants will do. So just something to keep in mind. And so soil, again, another thing that is really important to pay attention to. So if you have containers, if you're growing in smaller containers, that's going to be really important to pay attention to the soil. Getting potting soil for your containers, and then understanding that you're going to need to supplement each year with extra compost and amendment. More so in a container than in an in-ground garden or a raised garden bed, right? Because you just have that limited amount of space, so that plant can only draw on so much nutrient. So that's why you need to be conscious that you have to every year probably take some of that soil, that used soil, out of a container and replace it with some new stuff, some new compost, some new amendment. Let's see. And regardless of whether you have a container or not, you're wanting to pay attention to your soil. So in terms of small spaces, and in particular when you're talking about container gardening, say you are on a balcony or just, you know, have stuff on your patio, these are some of the vegetables that will grow well in a container. So tomatoes, especially cherry tomatoes or smaller paste tomatoes, again, you're thinking about volume of nutrient and soil that they have to pull is limited, right? So you're not thinking about growing some big juicy tomato here because it has to draw out a lot of nutrient to grow. Beans do well in containers. A lot of herbs do really well in containers. You can see those all there: chives, mint, sage, parsley, cilantro, dill, thyme, basil. A lot of greens can do well in containers too, because again, greens aren't heavy feeders. So there are light feeders in terms of vegetables, and there are heavy feeders, ones that need a lot more nutrient. And greens are light feeders. So spinach, lettuce, kale, mustard greens, all of those things do well in containers. Radishes, peppers, eggplant, carrots, peas, a lot of edible flowers, also strawberries. So those are a lot of good options for you if you have small spaces, and especially if you're thinking about growing in pots. So keeping all of those in mind. Veggies to avoid if you have small spaces are things like corn. For corn to grow well, and because it's wind pollinated, you need a fairly substantial block of corn. So that takes up a lot of space, and it's really not worth, for the yield that you get out, often it's just not worth the space that it takes up. Squashes also take up a lot of space, both winter and summer squash. One summer squash will take up a 3 to 4 foot area. So that's hard to grow in a container, one, because it needs a lot of nutrient, and hard to grow in a small space. Brussels sprouts and artichokes, definitely not good options for container planting. Neither are potatoes. So some of what I recommend that when you do have small spaces is that you grow things like tomatoes and lettuce and herbs, things that are best picked fresh from your garden, and you buy things like potatoes and oftentimes carrots or beets or root crops or onions or things like that from our local growers, or your local growers wherever you might be, because those are fairly inexpensive to buy locally and grown organically, whereas some of these other things are best just freshly picked from your garden. So think about designing in that way as well. You can do potatoes in these kind of potato towers. So that is one option. So if you do want to grow potatoes, and some people are thinking, preparing for the pandemic, what's a high caloric food? And potatoes is one of them. So that is one exception where rather than taking up a huge amount of space, you can grow what's called a potato tower. And if you want more information about that, just Google potato tower and there'll be a lot of examples of that. And basically, just real quick, you plant the potatoes, and as they grow up, you add more soil and more mulch, and then you take this apart at the end of the season. So definitely keep that in mind. Next, I just wanted to go over some garden design ideas, just ways in which you can maximize your space. And please feel free to add others if you have them. Like Adrian was saying, they're going to hang some pots from the fence. So first of all, like I said, you can grow these. Here are a bunch of different things that are growing in containers. Carrots, tomatoes, lettuces, and chard do fairly well in kind of that small space. Again, just you can make a container full of lettuce and greens for your garden, and they'll do just fine. There's a little bit of parsley growing there too. So those are definitely options. Then you can go up to these types of containers. I'm not sure if people have heard of these. They're called earth boxes. Another thing that you can look up where they have on the bottom here, there's a water in the bottom area, so they're wicking beds basically, and they wick up the moisture from the bottom. The roots wick up the moisture from the bottom, and so you have to water a lot less. They conserve a lot of water, and again, you can grow. This is a really great way to grow tomatoes. So that's another option. And then, of course, if you have limited space and you can go vertically, hanging containers from either your banisters or your balcony area or your windows. This is a great option because there are a lot of herbs in here, right? It can be right outside your kitchen window, and then you can just access it either by opening the window or just coming out the door here and being able to access it really easily. So think about that space. When I consult with clients, and often they might have a balcony area that's right outside of their kitchen, and then it goes down to a larger garden. And what I usually recommend is that you grow a lot of things in pots on your balcony, like herbs, like lettuce, like a few tomatoes, just stuff that you need, again, on a daily basis, that's easy to access just right outside on your balcony. And then you grow more of the stuff that has to grow year round, like main crops, what I've referred to in previous classes, like onions and potatoes and carrots and all of that kind of stuff out further out, because you don't need to look at all of that stuff on a regular basis. But if you do have a house where that's the setup, then I highly recommend planting some stuff close in on your balcony space. So great. Yeah, Thomas says, oh, hi, Thomas, that he's had good results with tomato buckets. That's great. So that's another thing to look up too. So another option too in terms of small spaces is something that's called square foot gardening. And this is where you divide up your bed into square feet. It is what it's named. And it tells you exactly how many lettuces or how many onions or how many broccolis will go in that 1 square foot space. And it allows you to pack in things really densely. It's a method. I personally don't use it because most of my beds are not square, or they're, I have a couple rectangular beds, but every other bed is kind of a different shape. So it doesn't work as well in my context, but it's definitely, I've done this for clients, it's definitely really helpful in terms of understanding spacing, and just a really quick and easy way to design your garden. So again, something you can look up, square foot gardening. There are all sorts of different images out there that show you how many beets per square foot. In this case, it's 1 broccoli per square foot, or 1 tomato per square foot, 1 pepper, and then for other things like spinach, you can probably put like 9 plants in there. For basil, you can probably put maybe 1 or 2 or something like that. So check that out as well as a great option for smaller spaces, and a good option, if you like that, obviously designing accordingly in terms of having your beds be more linear. Another thing to keep in mind is, in order to maximize a space, you can do what's called interplanting. And what I mean by that is that the main thing that I'm wanting to grow in this bed, so this is a bed of mine last year, are the broccoli, right, the kale, and the cabbage, right? But because those take a while to grow up, I can use this additional space in between to grow other things. So you can plant lettuce in here, and there's volunteer borage right here. And then there are some onions as well, and some mustard greens, and some dill. So by the time these are mature and ready to pick, right, or as these are growing, they're not robbing anything from the brassicas in here, right? And in fact, they're actually helping by keeping the soil moist and acting as a living mulch for those main plants. But by the time these get big enough, this lettuce will be done. So you can, extend you can extend your yield, right, in space if you have a limited amount of space. So interplanting is a really good idea, not only for the fact that you can maximize space, but also for the fact that you're not monocropping either. This is like a polyculture of different plants growing in a certain place, and so that confuses pests and cuts down on pest issues. So that's something to keep in mind, especially if you have smaller spaces. Here's another example at a client's last year, where we're growing Brussels sprouts in here. These are Brussels sprouts, and these are artichokes, right? Every year I try to convince her not to grow these because they take up so much space, but she loves them, so that's totally fine. So artichokes here, right? But they need a lot of space, right? Because these plants get really big. So in the meantime, we're growing radishes and endive and spinach and arugula between here, so that that space doesn't it's not empty. And here are some cosmos as well. So really great opportunity to again add some flowers into your garden space, and have that space be maximized. Because otherwise, right, even in here, you could probably grow a lot more. Otherwise, this soil is exposed, right? That means that the soil moisture is going to swing unless we have it mulched. So you might as well mulch it with living plants and then get a yield out of that in the meantime. Let's see. Oh, great. So Celine says that they'll be trying square foot gardening this year as well. Very cool. Yeah. So we have interplanting as an option, and then also planting really densely. So you don't want to crowd your plants out, but you certainly don't need to give them as much space so that the plants themselves again act like a living mulch. So this is inside my greenhouse last year, I think, where I have spinach and arugula and radish and lettuce all growing in here. Sometimes I broadcast it through here, and then I'm just picking it, right? I'm not doing lettuce heads, I'm doing it as a lettuce mix. Or you can do it in rows, but I usually put 3 rows in here so that everything comes up really densely and you're maximizing that space and that area. So definitely pay attention to how far apart you need to put things, and have the plants act as the mulch for the soil if you can. Hi, Rachel. So another great little small space option is the herb spiral, which is a quintessential permaculture example of, again, the pattern of the spiral in nature, the different microclimates, the fact that the rock absorbs heat during the day and radiates it out at night. But what this also does is you're going vertical, so you're maximizing the space. So this is roughly 6 feet across, right? But in 6 feet, you can see how many plants I've stuffed into one 6-foot area, right? So you have a ton of different, I have some peppers, I have some sweet basil, I have some lemon basil, oregano, sage, rosemary. I think there's like a volunteer lettuce down there or whatever, and there's like a little pond right there. But again, in a very small space, if you can go vertical like that, you can of course fit a lot more, and it makes it a lot more accessible. So this is the thing that I used as an example too, that this is, you want this to be right outside your back door so that it's accessible to you when you're doing your cooking. Okay. Next is, here are just other examples of herb spirals. Do not, even though this one shows it, do not put mint in your herb spiral because it'll take over your spiral just like all mint does. A lot of, when you see a lot of permaculture herb spirals out there, and they're always putting mint in, and it just will take everything over. So that is a great thing to have in a container. Or if you do have larger space, that's, I have mint in my food forest, so I don't care if it gets out of control in that context, but not in smaller spaces. Not a good idea. So these are just different examples of that. Really great opportunity too to get a little bit creative in your backyard. Oftentimes what I'll design for clients is maybe you have an herb spiral, but then you have maybe 3 or 4 raised beds. So you have a little bit of linearity in terms of if that's something that you like, but then you also have a space where it's a little bit more creative. So that's a great option. And then this is a good, again, something that came out of permaculture, this whole idea of a keyhole garden bed, where rather than a linear, 4x8 bed, you're twisting this around and being able to maximize your space a little bit more with a 2-foot path and a 3-foot center, so you can, just by walking in here, of course, access everything in and around this garden bed. And it's a little bit more space efficient, where you're not dedicating as much space to pathways. So definitely something to keep in mind. And here's another one where there's also designs where you're putting your compost right in the middle. And that's how you're kind of ending up feeding the soil for the plants in here. So really good example. I'm doing a, a, a version of this in my greenhouse this year, and we're going to see how it goes, where I am in the pathway in the middle, and I'll do a video about this as well. In the pathway in the middle, I am going to be putting my compost and adding red wiggler worms. So the pathway will become an area that's constantly generating fertility for the plants in the on the two sides of the pathway. So I will do a video on that as soon as I can. And here's just an example of, the keyhole bed extended to a mandala garden. So this is a good way to maximize, basically you're growing in this entire space. It's not a lot of space, but you can grow a lot in this area. And it's just a way to maximize the space rather than taking it up with pathways. So again, depending on what your sense of aesthetic is, what you're trying to accomplish, and what your goals are, I would say something like this is a really great option in terms of someone who prefers that kind of wilder look. If you need to put, if you're gone a lot, say during the summer, and need to put stuff on automatic irrigation, this is not the most ideal design, just in terms of setting up an automatic irrigation, but it's certainly pretty cool looking. So just again, another idea. This is just a simple design that I did for a client last year. Just some simple raised garden beds that have a little bit of height to them. Again, very small backyard area here, completely south facing, where this is about, 15, let's see, let me remember, these are 10 feet long. So this is 10 feet long. So again, we've packed a lot into a small area. And then this is it kind of later in the season, a little bit, well, mid-season, where we've put, we decided to put a bunch of flowers in this area to support the garden. And then there are nasturtiums and tomatoes and peppers and calendula and cucumbers over here, and then lavender and other flowers over here as well. So again, you have some beds that are supporting the vegetable gardens, and then you're planting really densely in these beds. Okay, Lorena asked, I just started burying some veggie scraps in my empty beds. Is this a good idea? Yep, totally. Yeah, you can put, if you bury veggie scraps on the very bottom and then build up from there, that's great. If you have extra leaves, if you have a bunch of kitchen scraps, that way you can even put sticks at the very bottom. Anything to give you some volume so that you're not having to buy in that much soil, because that can be a lot of soil, a lot more cost to it, and a lot of hauling of a lot of soil. So if you have options of accumulating kitchen scraps, say in 5-gallon buckets, and dumping them at the bottom of the raised beds to start out, highly recommend it. That's how I started a lot of my beds in my backyard, was collecting food scraps from the compost, from the co-op downtown, and just using that as the base layer. So definitely a great way of recycling your waste back into the system. So other things to do are to go vertical, of course, as well. So Pallet Gardens are, again, cheap, free, available. If you have limited space, you could do something like that for sure. These are some other ideas that I've found out there, using cans, again, something that would be normally a waste product or something that you would recycle. You connect those to a vertical space. Is anyone doing this? I know, Adrian, you said you were going to do this, but I don't know if anyone is already doing something like that. Um, Again, here's another example. I mean, you can do, there are some pretty innovative things out there in terms of vertical spaces. And I think this gets back to what your goals are for your site. In my Designing Your Dream Homestead class that you can watch again in this forum, is being really clear on that. If you want to be as self-reliant as possible, then you want to try to maximize as much of that space that you have in your backyard. And so going vertical is really a good idea. I love this one as well. Just ways that you can fit in a lot in one growing space. And then trellising, of course, is also an option. So again, if you do want to grow a lot of winter squash or beans or things that oftentimes sprawl and take up a lot of space, being able to trellis them up will give you more space so that you can grow stuff on the bottom here. And so this is an example of a small space. This is a client that I have, and she started out with just this balcony, and it was super bright, and there wasn't very much on it. And she wanted to be growing up in this space. So we put in this whole system where we put in these raised beds. There's this little rain barrel where we collect off of her roof. The water goes in here. So we use this water in order to water stuff in here. And then we made these little planters on the side so that she could grow in this area. This whole area is east facing, so I'm putting, lettuces and herbs and other greens mostly in this area. And then we put, things in pots everywhere. So, again, this is that side gutter area. Can grow a lot, right, in this vertical space. The other advantage is that because things are in containers, just below those gutters, we grow blueberries. And they give every year and they do really well. Normally, blueberries don't do well in our alkaline soils because our soils are alkaline and blueberries like acidic soils, but you can grow blueberries in containers because that way you can manipulate the pH. So if you've ever wanted to grow blueberries, you can do them here in containers. Let's see. So let's just have a look at Lorena says, I intend to use the bed this spring. I'm wondering if I can just keep digging spots in my garden. Yeah, I would limit where you put that compost, Lorena, if you're using the bed during the season. Or I would just start a compost pile and start accumulating it there. You probably don't want it while you're growing. There's a certain amount of trench composting, what's called trench composting, that you can do later in the fall. Once you've harvested everything, you can certainly start throwing your veggie scraps in there as a way of composting. But I think while things are growing, it's best to keep that separate. Yes, Celine. Yes, that is the one thing about vertical gardening. Celine says I have a difficulty keeping it well watered when it's vertical and off the ground. That's one thing to keep in mind with containers, right? So in an in-ground bed, I'm always recommending that you water less frequently and more deeply. But in container situations, you're going to have to water more often, just simply because, again, you don't have the volume in order for that container to keep that soil, in order for that soil to keep its moisture. So you are usually having to water once a day or once every 2 days. So the deeper you can have a container, the better. That's kind of we made these gutters deeper rather than regular gutters that are probably half the size, and that's one reason. And then we usually water this every second day, or she usually waters it every second day. Let's see. Adrian says, for boxes that hang on the fence, we were thinking of using black grass netting to allow water drainage on the bottom. Other ideas? What do you mean by that? Black grass netting. So just on the very bottom of it, or can you just drill holes in the bottom? So give me a little bit more information and hopefully I'll be able to answer that. Okay, so this is, again, so the same balcony area. This is a living wall. While this is not edible, it's pretty cool, just in terms of preventing kind of the reflection off of that, what was that white wall, and just creating this really nice, lush space. So just thinking about, again, this is a vertical growing wall by a company, the little cells that they sell. It's by a company called Grovert Living Walls. So if people are interested in that, just let me know. And then again, this is that same balcony area before we put stuff on it. And then we did put these boxes along this side of the balcony. So here's that rainwater barrel and those gutters. We hadn't yet put up the living wall yet, that's right there. But here are then 3 other planters that we put on that balcony where we grow tomatoes and squashes and peas and other things like that. So in a really quite a small space, a balcony space, we're growing a lot of food. And then we also have grapes growing in a container. And knock on wood, they have survived for the past, I think it's been 6 years now. So again, fairly large, 3.5 by 10-foot bed. But the grapes grow up and they do just fine every year. So, and again, you can see how below it, I'm still taking advantage of that space. We've gone vertically, but then there's still all this space below where we grow nasturtiums and kale and herbs throughout the season. And there's those tomatoes that were on that small bed. And then this is just hops growing up in a small area as well, where they're shading these more shade-loving plants below it. Just another option of being able to grow vertically in a very small space. Okay, let me know if there are any questions. Other things to keep in mind, of course, are if you do have small spaces, then extending your season on both sides is a really good idea so that you have a longer growing season in which to give yourself more food. And so using cold frames where at this time of year you can be planting directly into a cold frame that's outside, right? So, well, besides the 14 degrees or whatever that we got last night, hopefully moving forward we'll have pretty decent weather. So cold frames or using frost cloth to extend your season or have a longer season is a good way to maximize your space too. And then this company, Greenovisions, they're no longer in business, but it's out on the internet. They do sell plans for these movable gardens that they used to make. So again, that's also an option if you have limited space where you can move it around to different sunny areas during the day, or be able to put it in during the winter time. Just another great option for growing in small spaces. And then finally, this is just my greenhouse indoors. Again, you can see all sorts of different things growing. I don't know if there are any questions, but those are some of the ideas I had just in terms of garden design ideas and what plants you should grow and what kind of strategies you should use for maximizing space. So let me know if there are any questions. Let's see. Okay, so Adrian said drilling holes in the bottoms of the boxes is a good idea. We were thinking of ways to reduce weight on the fence. So hopefully leave off the bottom of the box. Yep. Yes. Yep. So I would do that. So that black fabric or using weed mat on the bottom, you could do that for sure. Just make sure the soil might become pretty heavy and might kind of burst through there. Or so I don't know how big your boxes are, but just keep that in mind that that might be a problem in terms of being able to reattach them somehow. Um, is there a way that you can put those boxes, have them have some vertical support so that they're not like hanging on the fence and drawing the fence down, but also have some kind of vertical support from below? So that would be an option as well. Um, Okay, so Ryan asks, could you give me a design suggestion for north side of fence? Was considering a fruit tree shrub that can grow high enough to get out of the shade. Right, so north side of the fence. That's a tricky one. Eventually that tree, yes, would grow up out of the shade, but until that point, it would be hard for it to get a lot of sun. There are things like, you know, raspberries, gooseberries, currants, they do well in partial shade, so that might be an option. Or is that a place where you can put greens, uh, or more shade tolerant veggies? Uh, lettuces and kales and all that kind of stuff. Is that an appropriate place to put them? I guess is my question. The other option would be ramps. So I don't know if you're familiar with ramps, but they're wild leeks, and they really like shaded spots. You can get them from the ramp farm. You have to send away for them, but that might be also an option too. They like shade. Ferns, which are also edible, you can eat the fiddleheads, so they do well. Ostrich ferns do well in the shade too, or hostas. Um, if you want, I guess it also depends on whether you want to, uh, if you want to cover the fence, the view of the fence. That might be something, and feel free to comment and let me know. Um, Great, Adrian. I'm glad that that's a good idea. Celine asks, do you know of anything we could do to protect from hail? Yeah, so a couple options. I've seen a few different things. One would be people have set up, um, and I don't know if I could find it here for you, whether this will work. People have set up basically posts, and you put basically netting over your entire garden. So you don't have to contain it all on the sides, but on the top, you put what would probably be the equivalent of bird netting or deer fence netting. I don't know if you've seen that. Um, and that will obviously, it won't protect it entirely, but it'll lessen the blow of large pieces of hail. So that is definitely an option. Or, being able to have those in the corners so that when you know that a hailstorm is coming, which you typically do unless you're not around for it, but typically you get these warnings. Then you could just throw like a frost cloth over top of it. But I think the netting is a good idea because with the frost cloth it might rip. But the netting, with it being what it is, it's a little bit more durable. So that's one option that I've seen that seems to work fairly effectively. It's not going to destroy, it's not probably going to protect everything entirely, but it's not going to have it be that you're going to have everything destroyed. Yeah. Great. You're welcome, Will. Um, yeah, I mean, Celine asks, would that be strong enough? And I think it would be if you had. if you really had a way of securing it in the corners. Um, we often just also, it depends if you want some kind of permanent fix or if you want something where, we put chairs on top of the garden beds or benches or tables or something like that. So having those available, that's an option. You don't have a huge space, so I would think something where you could just have some like 4 to 6 permanent posts across your garden bed might be a really great option. And then you have this netting where that could at least lessen the blow. Are there any other questions? And again, feel free, obviously, feel free to post more questions in the forum, and also share suggestions or anything. I'd love for people to start sharing, what's growing in their garden or in their greenhouse or what they have growing in terms of seedlings. But if you do have any follow-up questions, please feel free either to post them in the comments or to post them in the forum itself. Because what I'm realizing is that there are a lot of people with a lot of experience. So by posting it as just a main question in the forum, you'll also get other people being able to respond to it and not just me. So, cool, great. Well, I think you're welcome, Eileen. Thank you, Celine. So thank you, everybody, for joining me today. Again, get in touch if you do have any questions. And if you are watching this as the replay, also get in touch with me. Feel free to reach out. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. All right, take care. Bye.